Hello from the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I'm Robert Litwak, the Center's Senior Vice President and Director of International Security Studies. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this multimedia feature of the Wilson Quarterly's Summer 2022 issue. Entitled The Ripples of War, this issue of the WQ examines the cascading impacts of the Ukraine war that are reshaping the international order. To provide a geopolitical overview, we are fortunate to be joined today by Baroness Ashton, a life peer in the British House of Lords from London. She served as the European Union's first High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy from 2009 to 2014. In that capacity, she earned wide praise as a negotiator, leading the P5+1 talks on Iran's nuclear program, and forging an agreement between Serbia and Kosovo. As the European Union's foreign minister, she visited Kiev during Ukraine's Euromaidan protest. I'm proud to say that Baroness Ashton is a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center. Hello, Kathy. We're speaking today at the end of June, more than 4 months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. To start the conversation, can we get your assessment of how support for Ukraine is holding up?
Rob, it's great to see you. I'm sorry not to be with you in person. I think we can say that on the back of the NATO summit, the G7 meeting, there is very strong, consistent support for the people of Ukraine and for President Zelensky in his attempts to repel Russia from Ukraine. No question that support is pretty evenly spread across the European Union. We know there are some variations between countries, that's almost inevitable. But essentially, there is a very clear majority of people who think it's very important to be seen to support them. And of course, as you know very well, in the US, strong support from the president, from Congress, and I think from the people of America too.
Western societies are experiencing price increases in food and energy as a result of the war in Ukraine. Could this erode public support in the West for Ukraine in what is emerging as a protracted conflict?
There's always a danger that as conflicts go on, as they seem to continue for a long period of time, that people's attention, who are not directly affected by the war, moves to other issues. Other crises come along as well. And in these particular times, we do have a series of domestic challenges right across Europe and indeed the US, particularly affecting people in lower income households where it's harder for them to find the extra resources for increased energy prices, or indeed for increased prices in food and basic commodities. That's certainly going to happen in this country and across Europe, and I guess it's going to happen in the US. That is a challenge. It's a challenge not just for those people, but it's also a challenge for lawmakers and representatives in parliaments and in Congress who are mindful of their constituents' needs. Now, not all of this is to do with the war, but there are certain aspects of it that are. And so we have to be very cautious and mindful that people need to be able to feed their families, need to keep everybody warm in what could be harsh winters. And we need to be aware that this will be their priority. And that may have consequences for how support holds up, not because people feel, if you like, any the less concerned about Ukraine, but simply those domestic priorities take priority.
NATO countries are providing arms to assist Ukraine on the battlefield. But the primary instrument to put pressure on Putin at home to reverse his aggression is economic sanctions. How do you view the efficacy of economic sanctions? And you've seen them in a variety of different policy contexts.
I certainly have, and they're an important tool in the toolbox. They are, of course, designed to stop, reverse, make changes in the behavior, in the actions of an aggressor. They're not themselves going to resolve the problems, but they're an incredibly important tool because they send the strongest signal possible. And in the case of Russia and the case of the Ukraine crisis, what we've seen is a concerted effort, a joined up effort in a way that's not always been possible, particularly across the European Union, to have common cause. Mm-hmm. As those sanctions gone round by round, as they've got deeper and stronger, then you begin to see the effect that they have on the Russian economy. We're at the beginning of seeing that effect because inevitably, when they first start to be used, there are reserves, there are different ways, different approaches that Russia can take. But now we'll see them bite. And the hope is that they will cause a change of attitude or behavior, either with President Putin himself or those around him, such that it enables Ukraine to be able to push forward and see Russia leave its territory. So they're a strong set of sanctions, Rob. They're really important. They need to be held firm and clear. By themselves, they're not going to resolve everything, but they certainly can have a dramatic impact. And I think what's great is seeing everybody stick together on them.
Yeah, it's important in terms of trying to change Putin's calculus of decision making. So it's an important tool in the toolbox. Turning to the issue of international order, we don't know how or when this war will end, yet it is not too soon to begin thinking about a new security architecture for Europe. With your breadth of experience, can you share your thoughts on that?
I think it's really important that Ukraine remains in control of its own destiny. So it's very important that whatever we talk about and think about in terms of security architecture, we don't remove from them their absolute right to determine the future of their own country. Mm-hmm. So that's a fundamental. I think what we've seen are the pieces thrown up in the air, the things that we took for granted of the way that we had ambition for the way relations would develop, particularly with Russia. If you look back 10, 20 years, a lot of ambitions on trade and economic, not collaboration so much as opportunity, transactional maybe, but ways in which Russia could begin to feel a bit more part of the European continent. And a hope that we would start to see changes in how Russia was prepared to collaborate. As you know, Rob, I often point to the P5+1 as an example where the 5 permanent members, including Russia and China, worked incredibly closely with the United States, with France, with Britain, and the +1 of the P5+1, which was Germany, with the EU in the chair. That was an extraordinary experience of seeing what was possible in terms of collaboration. Not that we all had the same views by any means, but we held the same line. We had the same story, we had the same determination to get an agreement. And of course, in the end, we were successful. We all know what happened later, but we were successful. So I think what we're going to be looking for are ways in which, once the war is over, once we see Ukraine rebuilt, that we are able to develop an architecture that brings a kind of security across Europe, largely going to be focused on NATO. That has become more and more obvious in recent weeks. But it's going to be capable of making sure that what we've not done is simply ended a war and allowed Russia to regroup in order to come back. So this is about finding the reasons why Russia would not invade. Now, that's going to be a combination of things. Pressure, yes, but maybe incentive too. And we need to think carefully about even using that word, but actually what that could mean. But what I'm concerned about is that we don't end up in a situation where we've created different blocks of countries working together that, in a sense, drive us down the road of not being able to resolve this effectively. So, you know, the relations between Russia and China are going to be important in this. The BRICS countries, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they've recently been in discussion. The importance of making sure that the West stands together, but is also continuing to find ways in which, either through the UN or through organizational structures and frameworks that we've seen historically like the OSCE, trying to find ways in which we can still continue to push forward in collaborative efforts to try and bring Russia to the point where it does not see Ukraine as a source of conflict for itself, or indeed a country that it feels it can try and take.
Yeah, we're already beginning to see what the shape of that new security architecture will be. I mean, the NATO Council meeting in Madrid has approved the ascension of Finland and Sweden to NATO, which is a major development, certainly an unintended consequence of Ukraine for Putin. But that's left with, and you sort of you were addressing it in that last question, and I don't know if you have any further thoughts on that, because it really, the big gap in our thinking right now and the dilemma is, what to do about Russia in the future. I mean, various Western leaders have called for Vladimir Putin to be charged with war crimes. The Biden administration has said that the goal is not regime change, but at the same time, normal relations with Russia are not possible as long as he rules in the Kremlin. That's a huge dilemma. I mean, how do we develop diplomacy that kind of threads the needle between we don't want regime change, but normal relations with Russia aren't possible while Putin is there? I mean, where does that leave us? Do you see the possibility of a mixed strategy that has a containment component, as NATO is doing, but also allows for pragmatic engagement on issues? I mean, we need it on climate change. We need it on a host of different issues. And you had experience with the P5+1 on where some avenue of cooperation was still possible amongst the differences. Do you have any kind of thoughts on this context?
The problem is it's very, very difficult to imagine in these particular times, with everything that we're seeing happening in Ukraine, the circumstances where we would be collaborating with Russia right now. I think for many people, it's just impossible to see how we could sit down with them on any subject. But you are right. There are things where we are going to have to find ways to collaborate, or at least to have a dialogue, if it's not a proper collaboration, because there are issues on which the planet has to work. Climate change is the most obvious. Mm-hmm. Dealing with the after effects of COVID-19, and we don't quite know where that will take us yet. There are lots of issues where that's going to have to be a discussion that takes place between all nations, and that will include Russia. It's a big country. It has a lot of people, and it sits on the bit of land that connects them to Europe. That's also very important, because there's a lot of people who we have tried over the years to develop relations with. Forget Putin and the regime for the moment. This is also about people to people. It's also about the desire to see that in 20 years' time, we have a peaceful Russia that sees no reason to be in conflict with its neighbors, that sees its neighbors as people with whom it does business of some kind or another, and where you start to see the architecture being effective in guaranteeing, really, security for Europe and guaranteeing that there will be no need for conflict. Now, the components of that at this point are really difficult to imagine, but they will be some form of dialogue and discussion and debate. And I'm very keen that we start thinking about these elements, these blocks of the building blocks of a discussion sooner rather than later, because we know only too well that if we don't, by the time we get to the point where there is the need for discussion and all conflicts end around a table eventually of one kind or another, you can find yourself arguing about what the shape of that table should be and how to sit around it, rather than discussing and arguing about the content that you want to discuss and debate. So it's quite important that there is a level of thinking about what are the elements of a security architecture, what do we need to do, what could it look like, and kind of fast forward in our thinking to that time, difficult though it is, and then try and work out how we would get there, bearing in mind the need to continue to support Ukraine in this time of conflict, whatever.
Well, thank you, Kathy, because what you just described, I think, describes the mission and the sweet spot of the Wilson Center, which is not to be immersed in kind of tactical day-to-day decisions, but to use history, deep knowledge of regions and countries to provide perspective, to frame the discussion for the longer term for policymakers, policy-relevant scholarship. Thank you, Baroness Catherine Ashton, for that excellent overview. For viewers seeking additional perspectives on the Ukraine war, I commend the other online contributions in the Wilson Quarterly Summer 2022 issue, edited by Stephanie Bowen. This is Robert Litwak saying goodbye from the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C.